Welcome to the Wellbeing Show. I'm your host, Ken Gustin. I'd like to talk about something today that we've talked a lot about on the show, but since I just started my YouTube channel, I'd like to talk about it again so that the discussion of it gets on the YouTube channel. And what I'd like to talk about today is emotional trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Now, this is something that I know a lot about. There's been some traumatic incidents in my life, and so I would like to share my knowledge of this subject with you guys. It's interesting that I put this show together because unknowingly, when I was putting the show together over the weekend, there was a plumbing incident in my apartment, and it was kind of gross. And we took care of it. My roommate and I live in a very nice, well-run apartment building in Watertown. And all I had to do was call the superintendent, and someone came up and fixed the plumbing problem. But it didn't excuse the incident itself, and it came out of nowhere. And we've never had a problem like it. I won't get into details of it, but we never had a problem like that in that apartment. Anyway, so yesterday I called the landlord, and they came up and they fixed it. If you don't take care, it could have become a traumatic event if I had not taken care of it the way I did, and if it had gone on for a longer period of time. The incident happened Friday afternoon, and it stayed that way right up until yesterday. And then my roommate and I had to clean up the problem, and it was kind of gross. Anyway, so it could have been a traumatic event. Now it was still disturbing, and I think before I get started talking about trauma and PTSD, there's a difference between being disturbed by something and having it really become traumatic. So I wouldn't say this was traumatic, what happened with the plumbing incident, but it certainly was disturbing. Anyway, it's been taken care of, everything's fine in the house, and it's going to be okay. But it came out of nowhere. So we're going to talk about trauma and PTSD today. Emotional trauma, the sources of it, can come from different places. It can come from being exposed to combat in a war. A lot of people come back from Iraq or Afghanistan, coming back from the Ukrainian war and with Russia, and it can cause trauma and later on PTSD. Oftentimes, emotional trauma will lead to PTSD. In fact, more often than not, if it's not treated. Anyway, it can come from war. It can come from sexual assault, particularly women, if they get assaulted. It can come from verbal abuse or physical abuse. And it can come from personal loss, if it's the loss of a loved one or a friend. There's been multiple books and studies written about people who lose someone, particularly if they're very young, to death in some form. It's grief, and it can be very traumatizing. During World War One and after World War One, they didn't use the word emotional trauma and PTSD. It was called shell shock, and people who suffered from trauma during World War One, that's what they called it. It's called shell shock. I don't think much was known about trauma back then. I mean, this is over 100 years ago. And Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung and some of the other main staples in psychiatry, I don't think had a clear understanding of trauma. And I think that their theories helped a little bit with trauma and things like that, but not to the degree that the knowledge that we have today. The one thing that Sigmund Freud did believe in, which was very helpful, was the theory of repression. That if you repress your thoughts or your feelings, if you have been traumatized in some way and you repress it, you don't talk about it, you kind of squelch it into your psyche, it can manifest itself in really bad ways, mentally and physically. And that's called his theory of repression. And he developed this theory over 100 years ago. It's a long time ago. He was right about that. I mean, some of what Freud believed still holds today. Anyway, so emotional trauma and PTSD can have different reactions. It can be psychiatric. You know, you can get bipolar, you can get schizophrenia, you can get depression, you can get anger. There's physiological reactions. You can get cancer, you can get heart disease, stroke. There was a teacher, he wrote a book about trauma, and he said that he was teaching a class, about 35, 40 people in the class. And he said, which of you have had a lot of stress in your life? And like 2/3 of the class raised their hand. And then he said, how many people in the class have had a major physiological problem, like cancer, heart disease, or stroke, or something like that? And pretty much the same people who raise their hands for stress raise their hands for the physical end of it. So all these things interconnect. Another reaction to trauma can be nightmares. And this is a very common thing, because you cannot control what you dream. You can control it in the sense that if you get help for trauma, if you talk about your feelings with a therapist or someone, that can alleviate the nightmares. Other than that, when you go to sleep, there's not much you can do to control what you're dreaming. Okay. The other thing that can be affected by trauma is trust and love in relationships. And oftentimes people shut out other people if they've been traumatized. Let's see here. Now, child abuse is a main problem with PTSD and trauma. And there's a theory called the theory of attachment, which is the need to be nurtured by your loved ones, particularly when you're a child. And that's called the theory of attachment, because children are dependent on their caregivers, their guardians, their parents, or whatever, for love. From 1995 to 1997, the U.S. Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, developed the Adverse Childhood Experience Score based on a study they did. And this score measures neglect, abuse, family instability in your childhood years and in your family. The higher the score, the more likelihood of major health issues during your lifetime. It is a very helpful study. It's a very helpful score. And I suggest after I do my show, if anybody who's interested, you look up, it's called the ACE score, ACE, ACE score. It's an Adverse Childhood Experience score. And it's very helpful for therapists to know about it. It's very helpful, most therapists do know about it, if they're good. And I think most people who are interested in the subject should look it up, because it's an excellent resource to have. Okay. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, was first accepted as a clinical diagnosis by the American Psychiatric Association, or the APA, in 1980. So it took a long time for PTSD to really come on the scene as far as the diagnosis. Like I said, we understood shell shock and war and stuff, but it wasn't, people didn't really recognize trauma as a source of really big problems until the Psychiatric Association in the U.S. Really recognized it. And that wasn't until about 46 years ago. It was 1980. Symptoms of PTSD. They include nightmares, flashbacks, and auditory and visual hallucinations. Okay. Repressed thoughts can lead to PTSD. Now, I talked about this earlier about what Freud believed about repression. I don't know if you ever watched MASH. MASH went off it was a television show that ran from 1972 to 1983. I think I talked about this on my show a lot. And in the last episode, Hawkeye, who was the star of the show, it's played by Alan Alda, repressed an incident that he had in war, and he ended up in the hospital. And Sidney Friedman took care of him. Was the doctor who visited the soldiers, and the show took place in Korea. And anyway, so it was based on the last episode was about repression and how Hawkeye repressed bad experience. So we've known about repression for a long time, and the way he got out of it is because he talked about it with the doctor, and he eventually got on with his life. Anyway, so repression has been around the world. A lot of problems with trauma is if you cannot fight back. Now, this is what happens in child abuse. Because with children are exposed to whatever situation, whatever living situation they are in. They cannot fight back, oftentimes. They're too young. They cannot take care of their finances because their family's taking care of their finances for them. So they're kind of trapped. And if you cannot fight back when you're being assaulted, it oftentimes makes the trauma far worse. If you can fight back, it's not that bad. That's why in battle, if you're fighting back against the enemy, it's not, in my opinion, not as bad as if you're being really tormented. John McCain was a senator. He passed away several years ago, but he served in Vietnam, and he was caught by the Viet Cong, the Viet Cong, and he spent time in what they called the Hanoi Hilton, which was like a POW facility. And he was there, I believe, 4 years. And they put him in a cell. It's amazing he survived this. I mean, he went on to become a famous senator. He ran for president years ago, too. But he was tormented. And he said, they interviewed him after he was released. He came back to his family afterwards. He was released, and he came home and got on with his life. But he said that the worst part of it is that he had sleep deprivation, that the Vietnamese would not allow him to sleep. And he said that was the worst of it. So he could not fight back. He was held there in the Hanoi Hilton, and he could not fight back. So that makes PTSD all the worse. And the amazing thing with John McCain is, to my knowledge, he did not have PTSD. And you would think for someone who went through all the things he went through over there, he went through horrible things, came home and didn't have any PTSD. Now, it's interesting. Some people don't get PTSD. There are people who come home from war. They see battle. They lose their legs, their arms, and they're not traumatized by it. So it depends. It depends how much resilience you have. But oftentimes, battle and things like that do lead to trauma and PTSD. Now, the way it works in the brain is that in the brain you have two different parts of the brain. You have the emotional part of the brain, and you have the rational part of the brain. The emotional part of the brain is your acceptance of whatever is going on environmentally. The rational part is how you deal with it. Trauma can occur when an event activates the emotional part and overwhelms the rational part, because the rational controls how you control things emotionally. So if the rational part is overwhelmed, then the emotional part is also overwhelmed. They all interconnect. The other part of the brain, there's other parts of the brain I want to talk about as well. You have the amygdala. Now the amygdala part of the brain controls the fight and flight part of the brain. Now fight is when you get angry, and it's telling the amygdala is telling your brain that you have to fight back, that you have anger, that you have to repulse whatever is around you. And the flight means that you better get out of there. And that's what the amygdala tells your brain to do. It's part of the brain. It's in the back of your skull. And that's how you figure out and you judge a situation. And the amygdala activates almost immediately when you're in a particular situation. It doesn't just happen to people; it happens to animals as well, mammals, monkeys, giraffes, all animals. If they're in a very threatening situation, they either fight back to protect themselves or they run away. And that is the amygdala, and that is either fight or flight. If the amygdala gets overwhelmed by a situation, if it cannot control the situation, it can then lead to trauma and PTSD, and then it leads to all the other things I talked about today. So the amygdala controls all this, and the amygdala is the first really avenue for how we handle stress and how we handle threats and things like that. Now, another part of the brain is the neocortex. Now, the neocortex controls voluntary functions. It's part of the brain. It's part of the brain that tells the rest of your body what to do. Through the neocortex, it can tell your body how to heal itself. How to heal itself physically, how to heal itself mentally, because it controls how we respond to things. It's like the amygdala almost. And through yoga and exercise and going to a gym or go swimming or going for walks, the neocortex can repair the damage of whatever stresses you may have. I found this particularly true with going to the gym and doing yoga, because it's relaxing and it makes you feel better, and going to the gym, and releases endorphins into the brain, exercise. And by doing that, it repairs the emotional damage of whatever trauma you're going through. So that's the neocortex. Now, there are different chemicals associated with trauma and PTSD. And the ones that I think are the most important, I wrote them down here, are cortisol, serotonin, adrenaline, dopamine, and endorphins. And all these chemicals do different things. They control your energy level. They control your fight or flight, your amygdala. Those are the chemicals that control your amygdala. Some of these drugs we've known about for a long time. Some of them have recently come to light. We've known about adrenaline and dopamine for a while. A lot of psychotropic medications are based on dopamine, a lot of the older ones in particular. A lot of the newer ones are based on serotonin. And serotonin came to light in the 1980s. I don't like talking about medications on my show. I don't recommend medications. I don't talk about it all that much. I don't believe that. I don't want to steer anybody in the wrong direction. And with medications, what works for one person does not necessarily work for someone else. So I'm not advising people to take different things. But serotonin began being used in the 1980s, and a lot of the antidepressants are based on serotonin. Endorphins. That's the chemical that's released when you exercise. And it puts you in a good mood. It controls your balance. It controls your equilibrium. So those are endorphins. Cortisol also is an energy drug, energy chemical. And so if you have too much cortisol, you can get hyperactive. If there's not enough cortisol, you can get depressed. So that's a chemical to think about too. Recovery. Okay. The main goal of recovery is to restore a healthy balance between the emotional and rational parts of the brain and have a clean amygdala. That is the main goal, in my opinion, of recovery. Just to sum it up. How to pull yourself out of emotional trauma and PTSD, how to respond to it. If you can do that, you'll be okay. You also should recognize the psychological significance of trauma in a safe, constructive way. Now, how you do that is up to you. You can talk. I'll be honest with you, and I drive my roommate crazy with this because I do this all the time. I talk to myself a lot. And I've been doing this for a very long time. I'm not saying people should go out and talk to themselves. That's up to you. But when I'm home and there's nobody around, I talk to myself, and I talk to myself a lot sometimes. I'm not screaming at myself or anything, but I talk to myself because there's no one else to talk to, so I'm talking to myself. And oftentimes my roommate will come out of his room and say, "Who the hell are you talking to?" And I'm talking to myself, and he gets upset with me. But I like to talk to myself, and I've been doing this for my whole adult life. Anyway, so one of the ways of dealing with trauma and PTSD is to recognize it by talking it out. There was a comedian back in the 1950s. His name was Sid Caesar. And Sid Caesar worked with Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner on a show called Your Show of Shows, which was really big back in the 50s. Imogene Coca was in it too. And he had very bad, significant mental health issues, Sid Caesar. And he didn't want to see a therapist. He didn't want to talk about it with anybody. So he bought a tape recorder. And he would talk into the tape recorder. And then he'd play it back. And that seemed to help him. So that was his way of coping. A lot of people like to write things down. I write things down constantly. Before I talk to my therapist, who I see on a regular basis, I write everything down first. And it's a release, and I like to write things down. It's not only helpful for the therapy session, but I like to get it off my chest and to write things down. When I go home today, I'm going to write down what happened with the plumbing situation in the apartment over the weekend. Anyway, that's one way of coping. And the other thing that you should try and do, in my opinion, is to learn to love life again if you've lost it. If for some reason you don't really love your life, if you're kind of despondent, you feel bad about the way things are going, learning to love again, learning to love life again. I think that's very important. Methods of healing. Now, this is very important. I mean, now we're getting into the meat and potatoes of the whole thing. But methods of healing. First of all, you got to make the conscious decision to heal. And that's not always easy. You have to accept that you have a problem. There's a lot of people walking around who don't want to basically decide that they have a problem. And it's sad because they maybe in the back of their mind they know, but they don't make the conscious decision to get better because they don't want to admit that they got a problem. They want to squelch it and not talk about it. So make the conscious decision to heal. Do a self-study. Figure out what's wrong. Seeing a skilled doctor and or therapist who you feel comfortable and safe with on a regular basis. And hopefully you build a good rapport with your clinician, which is very important. Hopefully it's a good clinical practice that they have, or a good organization that they're a part of. So health insurance comes into the whole thing because your insurance should cover this. Taking part in support groups can be very helpful, like Alcoholics Anonymous, which is one of the bigger ones. Taking appropriate medications that are prescribed by a licensed, competent doctor or nurse. That can help, obviously. Peer support. Now, they've done studies with peer support that are very interesting. A lot of people who are in the hospital have mental health issues. They don't want to see a doctor or a nurse or a social worker or a counselor or something. They'd rather talk to someone who has had life experience similar to their own. So it's peer support, and it's very helpful. And people recover faster oftentimes if they talk to a peer, someone who's been through what they've been through, particularly if the peer has gotten through it and is doing well. So peer support is good. Healthy relationships, that helps. Having nice parents, having a nice sibling, a brother and sister, having friends. For me right now, my chosen family is closer to me than my actual family. But I'm very close to my chosen family, and what I mean chosen is that they're not my blood relatives. My blood relatives I'm not on such good terms with. So I have other people who mean a lot to me in my life, who I consider my chosen family. So having healthy relationships is important. And exercise and yoga, which we talked about earlier, is important as well. Exercise, you can go for walks. It's a nice day today, so maybe get out and go for a walk. Go swimming. You can go swimming at the YWCA. Go to the gym, which is what I like to do. I like going to a gym. But get enough exercise. Be out and around. Be active. And yoga. There are forms of yoga you can do that are not that difficult. Restorative yoga, which is one I like to do because I have vertigo and I'm not very well coordinated physically, and I never have been. So the yoga I do is restorative. I like it. It calms me down. You go to the yoga studio. There's a yoga studio down the street from where I live. I take part in yoga classes sometimes. And it's nice and it's pleasant, and I enjoy doing it. So yoga can help. So just to conclude here, in the past decade, psychiatric recovery has become much more focused on trauma. More people see a therapist in addition to the doctor to sort out their feelings. This combination has led to huge success, in my opinion. Prior to about 10 or 15 years ago, you would only go see your psychiatrist maybe for 15, 20 minutes, or if you're lucky, a half hour every 2 weeks. And you check in with them, they ask you how you're doing, they give you your medications, and they send you on your way. This was prior to 15 years ago. For the last 10, 15 years, which is when I started going to therapy, you see a therapist. It can be a counselor, it can be a social worker, and you talk about your feelings, and that's in addition to your doctor or nurse. So just to sum up here, as Confucius said, our greatest glory is not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. And there's a lot of truth to that. Thank you so much for watching today. This has been the Wellbeing Show. I'm your host, Ken Gustin.